Hi, good morning. I hope you had a good weekend and a lovely time. So I'm back again after a bit of a gap at Giri's Adda. We've been doing a lot of songs over the last couple of weeks at least, I should say. Talat Mahmood, Mahendra Kapoor, and then of course we've started doing SP Balasubramaniam, celebrating him in fact. So I thought I must do something slightly different today and have a conversation which I believe is important and which can help us think through a few things. But before that, let me thank you all for helping Girizada cross 150 family members, subscribers. I think that's a very nice thing to note. I know several people are coming to the Adda to see the material, the songs, and other things that are available. But then, special thanks to those who have chosen to become family members, permanent invitees to the Adda. So I hope that this tribe keeps increasing as the days go by. So the point that I'm going to be talking about today is about things that are old, really old. So have you at any point of time stopped and asked yourself this question? What is the oldest thing that I have in my house? It's a very interesting question. So that old thing can be a very old watch that was worn by your father or your grandfather or great grandfather. It can be pieces of jewelry. It can even be a very old sari. It can be pieces of furniture. It can be an old clock which is still ticking, perhaps, or has been kept away because it reminds the family of so many things. So, I'm going to be talking about one old, very old thing that I have in my possession. Well, actually, there are two, but then I'm going to be talking about one. The sad part sometimes with these old things is as you keep shifting home, and I am somebody who has shifted probably more than 20 houses, then, because of our sheer carelessness, we sometimes tend to dispose away some of these things and we don't bother about them. But luckily, the thing that I'm going to be talking to you about is still with me. Uh, it is about 100 years old from what I can make out. And let me show this to you. Okay, so my grandfather, Krishnagiri Venkoba Rao Rama Rao, long name, and that word Krishnagiri comes into my name as well. And that's another story, so I don't want to get there. He was a school inspector in the British era, about more than 100 years ago. And to be a school inspector those days was something of a prestige. My grandfather was a BA honors, very rare at that point of time, and he was a school inspector. So during my childhood, my grandmother, who I used to call as Aji, and my grandfather, of course, is Aja. So Aji used to regale me with many an anecdote from Aja's life. So she used to proudly tell me how much he was sought after as a person, how their home used to always be filled with people who came looking for him, and how she had to work day and night to feed so many people, give them coffee and this and that and the other. So he said your grandfather helped many people to get jobs in Bangalore during those days, within the education department. And there was a special mention of one of his supervisors, maybe an education officer called Yates, Yates, Yates. And this gentleman used to come home very often, it seems, to chat with my Aja. And he, of course, loved Aji's filter coffee, which he used to supply, you know, happily to him. So many such stories about grandpa. And as a child, of course, my grandmother was a great storyteller. She read out the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, Vikramaditya's stories, and she all read it out in Tamil to me. In fact, she had Tamil books. She would read it from those books and translate them into Marathi, even as I slept by her side and listened to those uh, wonderful epics and stories and so on. Um, as I uh, grew up, and particularly when I moved into the field of education after, of course, training as an engineer, my interest in Acha increased. Uh, so questions such as what kind of a school inspector was he? We still talk about school monitoring, school support, school visits, and so on. And in today's India, we have the cluster resource coordinator. In some places, they're called as the cluster academic coordinators, who are supposed to go on a school beat or a school visit, uh, and then look at what teachers are doing in classrooms and sit with them and help them and so on and so forth. So this was the question: what kind of schools were there? What was Aja doing in those schools? And what was his understanding of education? And so on. Of course, he passed away very, very early, 1931 or 32, when my dad was just 7 years old. And so my dad doesn't have too many recollections of Aja. So one has to piece this man from different stories and the anecdotes that different people supply. But what I have with me is something that is a little more definitive. It gives us an idea of what this uh, you know uh, person uh, was like. And so this diary, and I'm going to focus only on one aspect of this diary today. It's a pocket book, you can easily slip this into your pockets. So what is the most, it's got addresses of people. It's got, for example, it's got, uh, uh, what should I say? It's got some accounts. So I think Aja was, uh, you know, giving money to people, and look at the kind of uh, uh, money he gave people, or who people who borrowed from him. 10 rupees, 2 rupees, and then there's an account of family expenses, contingent expenses, and so on and so forth. So there is this, and then there are other things here, like for example, and I think this doesn't look like Aja's handwriting, because he wrote in black ink, and this is of course in blue ink. This is a few pages devoted to horoscopes of my grandmother and uh, their children, who were born at different points of time. So, notes on the horoscopes. And then, of course, the most interesting part for this, some of it is written in uh, Tamil, which I'll need to decipher as we go along. But the part that is interesting for our discussions today is a set of classroom observations that Aja made on his rounds as school inspector. And I believe that he had a cycle, and he used to cycle around in Bangalore. Not a very big town, a lazy, sleepy town those days. I'm talking of the period 1910, 1920, all the way perhaps up to 1930. Ajo also worked in the Madras presidency. He worked in different parts in what is now Chennai, and I think Tirupattur perhaps, uh, one or two more places. So as I do a little more research on him, I'll be able to, uh, get that. So what is interesting is, what did he see inside the classrooms of 100 years ago? That is the fascinating part, and I want to spend a few minutes on that. So he's visited the class of a person called Narayan Rao. There's no date written over here, uh, but then look at some of his observations. So Narayan Rao, perhaps I think 1920s, is doing a lesson about pronouns. Uh, he has written three sentences on the blackboard, Mayaja says, and the three had no pronouns in them. So the question is, how was he going to teach about pronouns from sentences which didn't have them? Uh, and then, he goes on and he says, preparation, most unsuitable. No point in giving a lecture in English. So, there is this indictment, so to say. He's disappointed. What is this man doing? I mean, he's supposed to be teaching pronouns, but he's. And remember, my Aja's English was quite immaculate if one goes through these notes. And then there's another entry of 29th October 1931. This is about 90 years ago. Class 4, C. Ramaya, who is the teacher who is doing an English lesson. And again, this is about personal pronouns. The teacher began by asking the boys whether they knew the letters of the English alphabet and asked them to name them. How many letters are there? And again, here Aja says, preparation very artificial, no connection with the presentation. So you're writing something on the board, you're asking something else. And then, of course, the teacher, very interestingly, asks the boys to run, to walk. And what is he doing? The teacher asks. What are they doing? And then, he asks a few more questions. What am I? Someone says, you're a teacher. Then he says, no. Am I a boy? I mean, there are all these conversations that are, exchanges that are happening in the classroom. But then I think the teacher, in fact, this is what Aja says, and he's now written in, this is the only place where he's probably written in crayons. I think his ink pen, ran out of ink. So he says, on 29th of October 1931, Aja wrote in this diary, the teacher did not have a clear and definite aim and was not definite about the sentences or forms of sentences which he wanted to teach. That's why there was a mixture of nouns and verbs and the use of the negative. What about reading the sentence on the blackboard? I think this is a very interesting and profound statement. So when you get into a classroom and, what is the plan for that day? What is the aim of that classroom? I think that's something that was completely missing. It's a very, very important, thing for a teacher. You just can't be aimlessly doing things, right? Later on, K.S. Subbarayan, a lesson on English. And again, I think Aja finally, I don't want to read everything over here, but the final statement that Aja makes, Aja K V Rama Rao makes, interest must be created and the attention of the boys must be riveted on the lesson. The teacher must be more resourceful. So let me kind of stop my readings from this wonderful little diary, a very precious possession of mine at this point, and look at some of the underlying things that my grandfather was trying to say about 100 years ago. I think what is very clear from his observations is this whole matter of how do you make learning interesting? How do you make classrooms, interesting spaces? And how do you get children to apply themselves? Get them to ask, get them to be curious, get them to question things. The second thing is, of course, the teacher being clear about what he or she should be doing and not doing something aimlessly or without any connection with what is meant to be done. And of course, the last comment is about creating interest, which is really critical. Now, I have spent the last 28 years now in the field of education. And I have visited thousands of schools across the country in these last almost 3 decades. And one of the things that strikes me, and of course very sadly, is how dull and uninteresting our classrooms are. So here we have a span of 100 years of education in this country, pre-British, post-British, with the post-British period being characterized by so many schemes, right from independence till today. I don't even want to name them. Thousands and thousands of crores spent on school buildings, teacher recruitment, teacher training, textbooks, curricula, etc., etc., etc. But still in 2020, our classrooms are dull, uninteresting, boring. They don't challenge the children. They don't nurture their curiosity, and in most places, it's a sheer waste of time. I just want to share one last anecdote before I end this. I was working in Kargil district around 2006 to 7 for about 15 months. I had the opportunity to go there every month and do some work with the Hill Development Council. I was invited there as a resource person by the Hill Development Council. As part of my work, we undertook a lot of classroom observations to find out what was happening inside the classrooms. And then, based on that analysis or information, we wanted to develop an educational strategy for the district. That was the idea. Uh, our classroom observations used a structured tool. There were non-participant observations in the sense that the observer was to sit in a very unobtrusive and non-interfering manner in the classroom, some corner of the classroom, and quietly observe what was happening and then mark in that tool. So one of the pieces of data that was very startling when we analyzed it is that on an average, the children asked about 1.5 questions to the teacher in every class. And these questions were also more of a factual nature. In fact, sometimes they asked, "Can you please repeat this? I haven't heard you." Or the question was very factual. It had something to do with a number or a date or whatever. Uh, the other part was also equally, I think, between 1 to 2 questions asked by the teacher to the children. So this data was very startling. It was very interesting, of course. We were startled because perhaps now we shouldn't have been, because we should have known. But then when you see this number, you begin to wonder as to what kind of classrooms do we have in which children are asking barely a question, in which the teacher is barely asking a question. And even when the questions are asked, these are factual questions that are being asked. So sometimes I wonder what has changed in 100 years, especially where it concerns the nature of the classroom, the nature of the teaching learning process. And isn't this at the heart of education? That learning process must be gripping, interesting, exciting. It must make the child think, struggle, look for patterns, look for, underlying pieces of understanding, insights, and so on and so forth. I think that is on that one score, we haven't really moved from Aja's days. And this is the note that I want to end with. Of course, I'm not going to be giving solutions over here. We can perhaps talk about it in a separate episode. But then this little diary serves to tell us that the classrooms of the 1920s in British India, in a place like Bangalore, are virtually no different from the classrooms of today in 2020 in India, perhaps most of the places. I'm not talking about the exceptions. The exceptions are always great, and teachers are always motivated, come what may. Thank you very much. Have a great day and a week ahead, and lots of songs and other things coming up at Girizada. Bye bye.